There's a high probability they'll be the ones that solve the crime. They want to finish Lou's work.
I'm going out doing surveillance, grabbing DNA out, folks.
We sent it to our lab, and then they test it.
DNA is a new field that's advancing rapidly. We've seen a lot of cold cases being solved.
The technology for DNA has come a long way since 1996.
There's never been a better time to solve the case than there is today.
We're coming for you, and you will be found.
Lots of jurisdictions, and we've had a change of leadership in the Boulder Police. Some of the, frankly, boneheads were dismissed, and we've got a new group running the place, and it's very encouraging. Secondly, DNA technology has advanced so much in the last 30 years. Lou Smith, the detective who was brought in by the district attorney early on, legendary detective, solved over 200 homicides in his career, said, John, this case will be solved by DNA. And I think we're at that point now, if we use the technology that's available.
So, John, let's actually play a soundbite of some of that new DNA technology, because there's a key piece of evidence that is yet to be tested. Let's watch it.
The only way that the case can be solved is through DNA testing of all the items of physical evidence, and most importantly, the garrote, which has never been tested, and it's an important item of physical evidence because it was hand-tied by somebody's fingers and then used to strangle JonBenet. That's never been tested for DNA, to my knowledge. I have gotten no assurance that it's going to be done.
And John, you think this is the key to solving your daughter's murder?
Well, the key is to be sure that we've tested all the crime scene evidence that was taken from the scene at the time. The other piece is that we need to use this new approach to using DNA to investigate rather than just to convict. You know, the DNA database that was set up by the federal government is 30 years old. It's advanced so far. There's a new approach called forensic genealogy research that is allows you to use vast amounts of DNA information to investigate the crime, and that's the piece that needs to be used.
John, what do you remember most about your daughter? I mean, I was 2 years old when this case took place, and as a criminal justice student, we always studied this case. So I didn't get to see it take place in the media. So tell me about your daughter, what you remember most about her.
Well, she was Daddy's girl, and she really, she was very proud of the fact she was named after me, and I was, of course, proud of that as well. She had she was a very extroverted little girl, very up, and the one memory I have of her is very vivid.
To imagine an alternate version of the JonBenet Ramsey case, we must first suspend what the historical forensic record has long suggested and insert a radical hypothetical, that every DNA sample recovered from the body, her clothing, and the makeshift ligature does not trace back to an unidentified male, but instead directly to her mother, Patsy Ramsey. Under this framing, the genetic traces beneath the child's fingernails, the residue on the underwear, the microscopic deposits on the waistband of her tights, and even the particles embedded in the fibers of the Garrett cord all align with Patsy. This inversion is not simply a reassignment of attribute, it reconstructs the foundation of the entire evidentiary structure. For nearly 3 decades, the narrative orbit has centered around the existence of male DNA unconnected to the family, sustaining intruder theories and casting doubt upon household culpability. If, instead, the same collection of samples uniformly aligned with the mother, the case would immediately lose its axis of ambiguity. The weight of this hypothesis lies not in sensational accusation, but in forensic consequence. DNA is regarded as the gold standard of criminal science, the invisible witness that neither forgets nor distorts. When genetic profiles converge upon one individual, especially a person of intimate proximity to the victim, investigators are compelled to reassess motive, opportunity, and staging with an intensity impossible under the current evidentiary balance. In this alternate scenario, the ransom note, once a perplexing manuscript filled with theatrical phrasing, morphs into what appears less like a hoax by a phantom faction, and more like a document authored by the very individual whose DNA saturates the scene. Fibers recovered from the blanket, the tape, and the Garrett handle, all linked through mitochondrial or nuclear analysis, reinforce the impression of maternal involvement rather than outsider intrusion. To evaluate such a premise responsibly, one cannot rely on personal history, psychological speculation, or character judgments. The mother's social standing, her illness, or her public persona are irrelevant within this analytic frame. Instead, the approach must remain to the discipline of forensic science, the calibration of DNA assays, the validation of chain of custody, the advances in genetic sequencing that now allow for near error-free identifications. A reconstruction under this assumption means reach original sample with modern technology, such as next-generation sequencing and genetic genealogy tools now operational in 2025, while simultaneously scrutinizing laboratory protocols from the late 1990s and early 2000s for potential contamination routes. The Colorado Bureau of Investigation's original testing between 1997 and 2008 produced partial male profiles that were later uploaded to CODIS. Under this hypothetical, those partial profiles would instead be complete female matches identical across all locations of collection, consistent with Patsy's genetic signature. The implication would be profound: the strongest pillar sustaining the outsider narrative collapses, and the entire investigative lens pivots inward. Yet such a radical shift also demands rigorous testing of alternative explanations. Could this alignment result from secondary transfer, a phenomenon in which household DNA becomes omnipresent due to constant contact? Could the overwhelming presence of a caregiver's genetic material merely reflect innocent domestic overlap, magnified by sensitive detection technologies? These questions must be dissected with the same meticulous rigor as the original intruder theories, for a false attribution risks condemning an individual on nothing more than environmental ubiquity. Therefore, the methodology in this exercise is trifold. First, a comparative forensic review examining the original reports, laboratory notes, and electropherogram data from the late 1990s through the 2000s, and translating those results into the standards of today. Second, the incorporation of advanced genetic tools available in 2025, particularly whole genome sequencing and genealogical triangulation, which can differentiate between true contributors and trace environmental carriers. Third, a logical framework that weighs plausibility, considers contamination vectors, and assesses whether this alternate interpretation could withstand courtroom scrutiny. By applying these steps, the hypothetical is not left in the realm of imagination, but is instead stress-tested against the very systems of evidence that shape real criminal proceedings. The significance of such analysis extends beyond the Ramsey case. It speaks to the malleability of investigative focus depending on how forensic data is interpreted and presented. When DNA indicates an outsider, entire careers are built around stranger danger profiles, forced entry reconstructions, and theories of predatory opportunists. When DNA points inward, suddenly the emphasis shifts to domestic conflict, parental cover-ups, and staged ransom demands. The very same physical objects, the blanket, the garrote, the underwear, can function either as shields protecting the family from suspicion or as weapons implicating them, depending solely on the genetic lens applied. This duality underscores the necessity of humility within forensic interpretation, reminding investigators that science provides probabilities, not omniscience, and that bias can enter not only through assumptions but also through the selective framing of results. Ultimately, the goal of constructing this scenario is not to rewrite history, but to extract lessons about the fragility of forensic certainty. If one change substituting male DNA for maternal DNA can invert the entire investigative trajectory, then the case exemplifies how dependent modern criminal justice has become on genetic evidence. It also highlights the dangers of overreliance on any single category of proof, whether genetic, fiber, handwriting, or behavioral. By dissecting this hypothetical with precision, one sees the vulnerabilities that accompany forensic authority, the ease with which interpretations can drift under the influence of prior assumptions, and the heavy consequences when a society builds its pursuit of justice upon what may, in some instances, be contaminated ground. When shifting the lens of this case into the imagined universe where every strand of DNA connects to Patsy Ramsey, the single most critical component to unpack is the material collected from JonBenet's body and garments. These samples have always been the anchor of the intruder hypothesis. They are what investigators pointed to when attempting to explain away the absence of forced entry, the improbable ransom note, and the staging of objects in the basement. Under our alternate premise, however, the DNA stops pointing outward and instead circles back directly to the mother. Each sample must therefore be reconsidered one by one, not just for what it suggests but also for the contradictions it introduces when aligned with modern forensic knowledge. Forensic teams retrieved scrapings from both of JonBenet's hands. In the real timeline, these scrapings produced partial profiles that leaned male and were considered foreign, not matching any member of the family. Those results provided one of the rare pieces of physical evidence used to defend the theory that she may have scratched an attacker during the fatal struggle. If, however, the profiles had aligned squarely with Patsy, the interpretation would shift dramatically. Fingernail DNA often signals direct and forceful contact, scratching, grasping, or defensive clawing during a fight. That type of evidence does not easily reconcile with innocent maternal transfer. Here lies the first paradox. A mother's genetic material under her child's nails could indicate something as benign as assisting with dressing, applying lotion, or brushing away hair. Yet in the context of a crime scene where the body shows signs of binding and neck constriction, the presence of her DNA would inevitably be interpreted as possible evidence of struggle. Investigators would ask whether the child quit mother while being subdued. However, this also conflicts with biological expectations. The reference allele data, when rerun in 2025 standards, would clearly mark the contributor as female, and analysts would have to confront the jarring realization that the DNA aligns with the MA profile, rather than the unidentified male believed for decades. The second major category consists of material taken from JonBenet's underwear and the waistband of her tights. Between 2003 and 2008, advances in touch DNA analysis allowed previously invisible fragments to be profiled. In reality, these fragments again led away from the family, contributing to the Boulder District Attorney's 2008 declaration that the Ramseys were effectively cleared by science. But in our alternate track, those same fragments test as consistent with Patsy. This shift reopens a new evidentiary battle. Is this proof of direct involvement, or merely household transfer? Clothing from a 6-year-old is frequently laundered, handled, and adjusted by the mother. The waistband of tights, in particular, is the very area where a parent would tug to help a child dress. The presence of maternal DNA there could easily be explained by everyday contact. Yet the case complicates when those fragments are detected not in isolation but mixed with trace blood from the victim. Mixture samples, especially when one contributor is the deceased and the other is a close caregiver, often escalate suspicion in the courtroom. A defense attorney could argue that such contact reflects nothing sinister. A prosecutor, however, would argue that the DNA-blood combination at the very site of clothing disturbance indicates deliberate involvement in staging or an attempt to redress the body after the fatal act. To truly understand how this would play out, one must place it in the timeline of forensic technology. Touch DNA was not widely applied until the mid-2000s, years after the homicide. Early CB work in 1997 relied primarily on STR testing with far higher thresholds for detection. Many of the original samples yielded partial profiles barely interpretable by late 90s standards. By 2008, however, the same items were yielding interpretable profiles thanks to improved sensitivity. If Patsy's DNA had been the consistent result across every iteration of first partial STRs, later confirmed profiles, the narrative trajectory of the investigation would have been reversed. Instead of male outsiders being uploaded to CODIS, the reports would have continually reaffirmed maternal contribution, making it almost impossible for the district attorney to publicly exonerate the family. One cannot discuss this scenario without grappling with contamination possibilities. Family DNA in domestic environments is omnipresent on bedding, toys, clothing, and skin. A mother's genetic material on a child's clothing is not inherently incriminating. Yet when that same DNA appears in locations associated with binding and post-mortem handling, the interpretation changes. Investigators would have to map potential transfer routes. Was the DNA deposited while dressing the child earlier that evening? Did laboratory technicians inadvertently introduce it by reusing swabs? Or does its presence across multiple independent sites, including the Garrett cord, indicate something more deliberate? The courts have long struggled with this issue. When a sample is too small, secondary transfer can create false associations. When it is consistent across multiple items, however, the probability of innocent transfer decreases. In this hypothetical, the sheer breadth of fingernails, underwear, tights would likely push jurors and investigators toward seeing the pattern as deliberate rather than incidental. The ripple effect cannot be overstated. Instead of building task forces to chase unknown predators, detectives would have been compelled to re-interview neighbors, family friends, and extended relatives with a new question. Could the mother herself have staged the scene? The ransom note, which already displayed linguistic quirks and handwriting similarities, would have been re-evaluated under the weight of genetic correlation. Laboratory staff would have rechecked pen impressions, paper stock, and ink composition with the assumption that the author and the DNA contributor were the same person. This alternate pathway underscores the fragility of investigative conclusions when reliant on cutting-edge but still evolving technologies. Had the science of the late 1990s detected maternal DNA rather than ambiguous male alleles, the case's narrative arc might have permanently embedded suspicion upon Patsy Ramsey, perhaps leading to prosecution despite the absence of direct witnesses. That possibility exposes how easily the interpretation of touch DNA can tip the scales between viewing evidence as environmental noise or as the decisive marker of guilt. In summary, if the genetic trail beneath the nails, on the underwear, and across the tights had pointed not to an unknown male, but to Patsy herself, the forensic and judicial trajectory of this case would have been unrecognizable compared to the reality we know. The contradiction between contamination and culpability would have been the central battleground, illustrating once more how the tiniest fragments of biological material can rewrite entire histories of crime. When imagining how the Ramsey case would appear if every recovered genetic fragment were tied to Patsy, the conversation inevitably reaches the question of what modern forensic capabilities, particularly in 2025, could do to either solidify or dismantle that assumption. The last 3 decades have not only sharpened laboratory methods, but have also transformed the landscape of genetic identification through the rise of genealogical databases, whole genome sequencing, and probabilistic genotyping software. To understand the depth of this transformation, we must place our hypothetical against the current state of science and ask how new tools would treat the same evidence today. Perhaps the most dramatic innovation has been the use of genealogical comparison platforms, databases originally designed for recreational ancestry tracing, such as 23andMe, Ancestridna, and GeneMatch. Law enforcement now routinely uploads crime scene profiles to these repositories, searching for partial matches with distant relatives and then working backward through genealogical triangulation to narrow down potential suspects. In actual practice, this is how investigators identified Joseph DeAngelo, the so-called Golden State Killer. If we transpose this technology onto the Ramsey evidence under our altered premise, the outcome would be starkly different from reality. Instead of partial male markers leading to speculative outsider matches, every entry would return to the maternal side of JonBenet's tree. The lineages would converge directly upon the Ramsey household, leaving no space for an unknown male predator. Analysts running the database queries would see near-perfect kinship overlaps, confirming that the contributor is not foreign but immediate family. The genetic family tree would align not with an external suspect, but with Patsy herself, collapsing decades of investigative scaffolding built around stranger now. Probabilistic genotyping software, now standard in 2025, addresses some of these risks by calculating likelihood ratios. Analysts feed in mixture samples, and the program generates statistical weights for whether a contributor is included or excluded. Yet even these advanced tools cannot fully resolve scenarios where one person's DNA dominates the environment. In our imagined case, every ratio would heavily favor Patsy as the major contributor, but scientists would still debate whether this reflects genuine incriminating deposition or overwhelming environmental saturation. Today's laboratories are capable of sequencing nearly the entire genome from trace samples. This means not just identifying sex markers and straw loci but also confirming ancestry, health traits, and familial connections with exquisite precision. Applied to the Ramsey evidence under this hypothesis, such sequencing would leave no ambiguity about whether the contributor is male or female. The idea that the profile could belong to an identified outsider would vanish, replaced by confirmation that the contributor is the mother. In contrast to the uncertainty of late 90s stir testing, whole genome sequencing would provide a near-absolute assignment, allowing little wiggle room for alternative interpretations. Such results in 2025 would not merely adjust the case, they would obliterate the existing structure of explanations. The intruder theory, once buoyed by the presence of foreign male DNA, would collapse instantly. The ransom note, already seen as suspicious, would now be interpreted as almost certainly authored by the same individual whose DNA appears across the scene. The possibility of household contamination could still be raised, but the breadth of alignment, fingernails, undergarments, tights, garrote, blanket would stretch that defense thin. Jurors in a courtroom would be told not that there was an unknown male suspect, but that every piece of biological material matched the mother. One additional caveat arises when genealogy is applied to immediate family situations. Databases are most effective when searching for distant relatives, they are less useful when the contributor is already within the household. Thus, while Patsy's DNA would clearly align with her lineage, genealogical methods would add little beyond confirming what standard sequencing already shows. This illustrates a limitation of genealogy's powerful for stranger identification but redundant when the suspected contributor is a known family member. By 2025 standards, the hypothesis that every genetic trace matches Patsy would represent a forensic earthquake. Genealogical databases would reinforce her profile within the family tree. Whole genome sequencing would eliminate any ambiguity about sex or ancestry. Probabilistic genotyping would assign staggering likelihood ratios pointing in her direction. Yet at the same time, contamination risks, household ubiquity, and interpretive challenges would complicate the story. The result is a paradox. Overwhelming genetic evidence suggesting maternal involvement, counterbalanced by scientific recognition that none is not context-free. This tension between decisive profiles and environmental transfer underscores why forensic science must remain cautious, skeptical, and open to complexity even when the data appears to speak with one voice. the significance of DNA cannot be evaluated in isolation. Forensic interpretation gains strength when multiple forms of physical evidence converge. Among the non-biological traces collected, fibers hold particular value because they act as silent travelers, carrying the imprint of garments and environments into places they should not naturally appear. If in this hypothetical scenario every genetic fragment aligns with Patsy, then the discovery of fibers matching her clothing becomes far more consequential. Instead of being one piece among many, the fiber evidence falls into a corroborative system, linking biological markers with material transfer in a single chain of inference. Forensic scientists studying textile shedding emphasize that fibers dislodge most readily during frictional contact. When a person embraces the other, restrains them, or even adjusts their clothing, minute threads detach from cuffs, sleeves, and seams, embedding themselves in adjacent fabrics. The process is mechanical, not spontaneous. Fibers do not leap unaided, they move through pressure drag, or shear. Thus, if threads consistent with a parent's jacket appear on a child's undergarments or bedding, the implication is not merely shared household environment but recent physical interaction at points of direct contact. The evidentiary value multiplies when DNA and fibers appear together. Imagine investigators retrieving a fragment from the waistband of tights that not only carries maternal DNA but also contains a colored fiber chemically consistent with a woman's jacket. In laboratory analysis, such fibers are examined using polarized light microscopy, microspectrophotometry, and in some cases, Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy to determine dye composition and polymer type. When those properties match the known garment in the suspect's wardrobe, the transfer link is established. Adding dye into the same evidentiary packet strengthens interpretation dramatically. The probability of independent innocent transfer decreases because two independent markers, genetic and textile, converge on the same individual. Setting aside biographies or household roles, the forensic logic operates on a simple binary: either fibers plus now arrived through casual contamination, or they were deposited during bodily interaction. Analysts would ask, how many fibers were recovered? Where were they located? Were they single or clustered? Forensic research demonstrates that single stray fibers can result from environmental drift, but clusters in protected areas beneath waistband elastic, within tied knots, or pressed under tape, are unlikely to be random. If both clusters of fibers and strongness signals are recovered from such intimate locations, the physical story suggests purposeful presence, not incidental overlap. Consider a hypothetical evidence sheet: garrote handle, female not consistent with Patsy, 2 blue fibers chemically matched to a jacket sleeve, tights waistband, maternal DNA mixed with victim's blood, 3 identical fibers under the elastic band. Blanket, mitochondrial DNA consistent with Patsy, 1 fiber entwined with child's hair strands. In this structure, DNA alone might be dismissed as household ubiquity. Fibers alone could be written off as background contamination. But the combination across multiple protected zones strengthens the inference of physical handling. Forensic science thrives on such convergences, where independent disciplines, biology and materials analysis, point in the same direction. The ultimate weight of DNA plus fiber evidence lies in demonstrating not merely that someone lived in the house, but that they interacted physically with specific objects tied to the fatal event. Fibers embedded in the garrote knots suggest active manipulation of the cord. Now on the same knots suggests skin contact during their tying or adjustment. When these signals overlap, forensic interpretation shifts from possibility to probability. The environment no longer looks like a passive collector of household residue, but rather like an active record of human touch and fabric displacement. Thus, in the alternate framework where every DNA trace leads to Patsy, fiber transfer functions as the silent partner in validation. Threads from a jacket sleeve, reinforced by corresponding genetic markers, eliminate the ambiguity that DNA alone might carry. The forensic mechanism is straightforward: friction releases fibers, touch deposits cells, and together they map a pattern of presence. By integrating material and genetic sciences, investigators would see not random coincidence, but physical proof of bodily contact with critical objects. In such a reading, the fibers cease to be background noise and become the threads that stitch DNA into a coherent story of involvement. Start with the object itself: 3 pages. Torn from a pad in the house, ink from a pen in the same orbit. Unusually long for a ransom demand, too many words where real kidnappers use silence. Commands, theater, stage cues. Now fold in the hypothesis: detectable maternal DNA along the page edges, on the pressure points where a hand anchors paper, maybe on the lower right corners where pages were turned. Under that finding, the fibers from a jacket sleeve we already traced become chorus, not solo. Material transfer plus genetic trace on the note ties presence to authorship, not merely to the room. Handwriting next. You don't need a biography to see mechanics. Disguise shows up as hesitation. Tremor where natural flow should be. Pen lifts inside words that normally write in a single stroke. patching on letters to rebuild shapes after second thoughts. Baseline drift line sinking, then snapping back, over punctuation. Capitalization that doesn't track learned habits. A forensic examiner maps class traits school-taught forms versus the tiny individual ticks nobody can fake for long. Under the hypothesis, deer on the paper narrows the field. The same hand that shed cells also pressed ink. Not proof by itself, but the alignment moves probability. Language tells its own story. The note over-explains. It performs toughness, then slips into a domestic voice. Amounts and timing sound like someone who knows the house, the schedule, the fear level inside those walls. Real extortion keeps it short, minimizes contact, limits risk. This writer lingers. Under the maternal-ness scenario, those choices read like cover, not negotiation. Write long, control the clock, create a script everyone must follow come morning. Consider deposition mechanics. Paper is a poor collector, but not immune. Oils from fingertips, shed epithelial cells, microscopic flakes from the web of the hand. Transfer spikes where force rises initial strokes, end-of-line hooks, where pages are torn free. If Dina hits those zones and not just random edges, you're looking at active writing, not passive handling. Add in micro creases under heavy downstrokes. Add in indented impressions on the pad below matched by ESTA. The picture tightens. Contrast with historical lab reality, no probative DAR recovered from the note, and the absence kept the unknown intruder story alive. Shift the variable now maternal profile lands on the document. The theory flips. The letter stops being evidence of a stranger's script and becomes a tool for in-house staging. The supposed kidnap instructions transform into a timeline device, delay discovery, steer movements. Seed a burial line to sound caring while explaining why the body stays inside. Chain of custody concerns still matter. Could secondary transfer from later handling seed the paper? Possible, but less persuasive if the strongest signals are in writing zones, not just along margins. And if the same profile rides the pen body, especially near the grip, you merge instrument and message. Its presence squared. Bottom line under the hypothesis, 3 convergences: textual excess, handwriting anomalies, and matched Dina at pressure sites. Pull the note out of the intruder column. The letter stops functioning as a threat and starts functioning as a shield. In that light, the crime scene looks less like invasion and more like orchestration, the paper trail serving to redirect attention, while the rest of the room is arranged to tell a different story. To understand how the entire structure of interpretation bends, when every Dina trace points inward, we need to step back into the basement and examine the core objects. These items, the improvised garrote, the rope fibers, the basement window, the nearby suitcase, the strip of tape, the blanket wrapped around the child are not just random artifacts. They are the scaffolding on which theories have been built. If we now graft maternal Dino onto each of them, the narrative tilts from intrusion to orchestration. The cord and paintbrush handle have long been treated as the signature instrument of the crime. Constructed from items found in the home, the device suggested planning rather than improvisation. Forensic tests in the late 1990s could not link the cord to any family member. But if, under this alternate reading, Patsy's Dino were retrieved from the knots, the handle, or the frayed cord ends, the implication would be unmistakable: direct hand-to-object contact during its assembly. Transfer here is not easily explained as casual. Household dot can float onto clothing or bedding, but it does not embed itself deep inside a Titan, not unless those hands tie it. From an investigative logic perspective, this finding would undercut the intruder hypothesis. Outsider theory depends on the idea that someone carried in their own tools, slipped through an entry point, and left minimal trace. If the cord came from within the house and the DNA belongs to the mother, then the narrative changes from opportunistic invasion to staged instrument. The object becomes less a weapon of chance and more a constructed prop of concealment. Supporters of the intruder narrative often pointed to the basement window as the likely route of entry. A broken pane was cited as evidence of forced access, and a suitcase found positioned under the window was interpreted as a possible stepping aid. Yet photographs showed cobwebs intact, dust undisturbed, and grime settled along the sill. Under normal forensic reasoning, such unbroken environmental markers argue against passage. In our alternate framework, where maternal DNA saturates the crime tools, these window and suitcase details gain sharper meaning. They reinforce the notion that entry was not external. If no outsider climbed in, then all action stemmed from someone already inside the property. The suitcase becomes less a ladder for an intruder and more an abandoned attempt to create the appearance of intrusion. If maternal dew were found on the suitcase handle or fabric flap in that context, it would not suggest that she moved it for travel, but that she positioned it deliberately to mislead investigators. 2 other key items complete the basement tableau: adhesive tape across the mouth and the blanket draped over the body. The tape's adhesive side is a potential goldmine for touch DNA because skin cells adhere during application. In reality, no probative family DNA was reported. But in this thought experiment, if Patsy's profile were retrieved from the sticky surface, the finding would strongly suggest her hands pressed it onto the skin. This action could not be attributed to routine contamination. Adhesive collects cells during use, not storage. The blanket adds another layer. A covering can be interpreted as an act of concealment or a gesture of post-mortem care. If maternal DNA were detected on the inner folds, particularly near where it tucked around the child's shoulders, investigators would debate intent. Was this evidence of remorse, wrapping the body in familiarity, or was it staging, designed to present the scene as one of intruder brutality offset by familial tenderness? Either way, the biological trace would pin the act on the mother, reshaping how the gesture is read. The presence of maternal DNA across these basement items collapses the logic of intrusion. The window ceases to function as an open door and reverts to a prop. The suitcase stops being a tool of escape and becomes a decoy. The cord no longer signals the ingenuity of a prowler, but the improvisation of someone within the walls. The tape ceases to point outward and instead functions as a record of deliberate placement by familiar hands. The blanket, finally, shifts from the act of a stranger to the last trace of a parent caught between concealment and care. Under this reconstructed framework, the basement scene does not read as the battlefield of a home invasion, but as a carefully staged set. Each object once thought to hint at outside intrusion becomes instead a mirror reflecting internal presence. Nye is the anchor. Its alignment the mother transforms ambiguous props into direct evidence. The window, the suitcase, the tape, the blanket all become less about strangers forcing entry and more about someone inside the family crafting a story, hoping fibers and dust would speak for them. But under modern analysis, the very traces meant to mislead would instead circle back, pointing to the hands that tied, pressed, and wrapped. The autopsy established two fatal mechanisms, a massive cranial blow and asphyxia from neck constriction. Either could independently cause death, but together they tell a layered story. Under ordinary interpretation, the combination left room for competing theories: an outsider attack, a family accident concealed, or a staged event. If in this alternate frame, maternal DNA is recovered on the cord blanket, and even under the nails, the analysis shifts. The medical findings stop being abstract wounds and become tied to direct physical contact. The fracture stretched nearly 8 inches across the skull. Tissue beneath showed hemorrhage, confirming the blow was delivered while the child was still alive. In the hypothetical, if maternal DNA were detected on the instrument suspected of causing the injury, say, a flashlight handle or another blunt household object, the forensic logic is unavoidable. She handled the device at the moment of impact. That raises motive questions. Was this sudden rage a momentary loss of control, or an accident during discipline? Investigators would weigh whether the cranial injury began as unintended, and whether the subsequent staging of the cord, the note, the tape was meant to redirect suspicion away from an unplanned blow. Autopsy photographs confirmed patterned abrasions matching the cord texture. In this reconstruction, the discovery of maternal DNA within the knots or around the cord fibers would indicate not just possession but use. Unlike DNA on clothing, which could result from routine contact, deposition inside a cinched knot is highly specific. That evidence would support a conclusion of intentional neck compression rather than accidental entanglement. It also eliminates the narrative of a passing intruder improvising. It points instead to a caregiver constructing a fatal restraint. The autopsy also documented tissue changes in the private area, which some experts interpreted as chronic irritation, others as post-mortem artifact. Historically, those ambiguities fueled speculation about prior harm. If maternal DNA is now assumed to be the dominant contributor across clothing and undergarments, the evidentiary meaning changes. It suggests direct handling of the garments in the hours surrounding the fatal event. That does not prove long-term misconduct, but it bolsters the argument that the mother redressed or repositioned the body to shape the scene. In the accident versus intent debate, this finding leans toward concealment of an initial injury rather than evidence of a sustained pattern. For years, some advocates proposed that small marks on the skin resembled electroshock injuries. That theory always relied on the presence of an outsider carrying such a device. Under our current hypothetical, with maternal DNA as the unifying trace, the stun gun idea collapses. Patsy was never associated with such an implement, and no device was recovered in the home. Modern forensic imaging has since cast doubt on the stun gun hypothesis, showing the marks could result from other household objects or post-mortem artifacts. In this scenario, the DNA pointing inward further undermines the electroshock claim, leaving it inconsistent with the pattern of evidence. Viewed through this altered genetic lens, the autopsy ceases to read as a record of an intruder's assault. Instead, the head trauma aligns with an internal blow, possibly unintended, while the garrote reflects subsequent intentional tightening to mask or redirect suspicion. The disputed signs abuse are reframed as evidence of post-mortem manipulation rather than external predation. and the stun gun hypothesis, already fragile, dissolves under the weight of internal DNA findings. Together, these elements recast the cause of death not as the work of a prowler, but as the tragic outcome of a domestic act followed by elaborate staging. With the injuries already reinterpreted through inward-facing DNA, the competing theories bend in predictable but important ways. Historically, this view leaned on foreign genetic markers and the idea of an unknown man slipping through a basement window, improvising with whatever he found. Take that pillar away. Replace it with maternal profiles on the cord knots, the adhesive side of tape, the waistband contact zone, and high-pressure writing areas on the note. The logic unravels. Outsider entry requires a path, disturbed dust, broken webbing, displaced grit, footwear trace. Here, the physical scene stays still while the biology points to someone already inside. Secondary transfer can explain a stray cell on a blanket or a cuff. It does not convincingly account for deposition inside tightened knots under elastic, or on sticky adhesive that collects skin during application. Nor does it square with a 3-page script drafted on household paper with matching tool marks and the same genetic contributor writing the grip area of the pen. Supporters of intrusion can pivot, arguing an unknown offender wore gloves, avoided contact, and left almost nothing. But that minimalist approach cannot coexist with a device assembled from family objects, and then registering the mother's profile where touch must have occurred. The more you minimize the outsider's presence, the more you maximize the insider's actions to make the scene speak. Under this hypothesis, the window becomes a prop, the suitcase a decoy, and the biological map points inward with consistency. Intruder theory is left stranded with no entry, no tool import, no independent DNA, only a narrative with its engine removed. Now flip the lens. When the same profile repeats across critical substrates, the internal involvement model gains force. Not because of biography or rumor, but because mechanism and placement align, knots that must be tied, tape that must be pressed, clothing that must be moved. Add the language excess of the letter overlong, over-explained, and the pattern reads like scene management after a fatal event. A head blow followed by neck compression, then rapid staging to redirect attention outward. Yet this is exactly where bias creeps in. Once labs and detectives see a repeating contributor from inside the home, the risk of tunnel vision spikes. Presence turns into presumption. Innocent rotes handling earlier in the evening, lab carryover, casual wardrobe contact can be waved off too quickly. The danger is mistaking ubiquity for intent. Confirmation bias will hunt for every shard that fits the story fibers here. Impressions there and discount the ones that don't have ambiguous marks, low-level alleles that fail to replicate. Anchoring on a single source of proof, no matter how persuasive, can turn interpretation into verdict. Guardrails are mandatory. Blind retesting of key items at independent facilities. Replicate extractions on the adhesive, on knot cross-sections, and beneath elastic channels to show reproducibility. Map transfer pathways experimentally with exemplar garments to test how often innocent handling produces the same deposition pattern. Require temporal links. Was the contributor's biology deposited in a way consistent with action during the fatal window, not hours before? Insist on convergence, DNA plus fibers plus tool impressions at protected loci. If those pillars stand together, the internal model is more than suspicion, it is a mechanism. Under the hypothesis, the outsider narrative loses its only durable scaffold. The unknown male trail and collapses into speculation without a road of entry or an independent biological anchor. The internal narrative hardens, but must still clear the contamination hurdle with method, replication, and placement logic. Get that right, and the pattern reads like this: a domestic blow, deliberate neck tightening, clothing repositioned, a script drafted to manufacture an abduction, and objects arranged to sell the story. Get it wrong, and ordinary household contact masquerades as guilt. The line between those outcomes is thin. The job is to keep science from mistaking proximity for intent. Once the prevailing theory is overturned by the assumption of maternal DNA on core objects, the natural next step in 2025 would be systematic re-examination of the evidence. Priority items include the ransom note and the improvised garrote. These artifacts hold the clearest potential for modern confirmation because they contain high-pressure zones where biological transfer is most likely, pen grips, letter indentations, and cord knots. With today's sequencing, even microtraces can yield complete profiles, making it possible to distinguish genuine deposition from background noise. If those samples consistently return to Patsy, the case trajectory would no longer resemble an intruder mystery, but rather a cold case revitalized by genetic certainty. Comparisons to other reopened cases help illustrate the point. The Golden State Killer investigation relied on partial profiles uploaded to genealogical databases, triangulating distant relatives until investigators built a family tree converging on Joseph D'Angelo. The method demonstrated how decades-old evidence could yield conclusive results when technology matured. Applied here, genealogy would not be needed to search the wider population. because the maternal contributor would be instantly recognizable, but it would serve as an independent confirmation of kinship. Running the profile through commercial ancestry databases would return an unmistakable alignment to JonBenet's maternal line, reinforcing that the DNA does not belong to a shadowy outsider but to someone within her household. Yet scientific caution remains essential. Reanalysis introduces its own hazards, especially when handling degraded samples. Contamination during original collection, storage, or later testing can generate misleading results. A fiber stored in a paper envelope for decades may collect ambient particles from the lab environment. Tape samples may trap modern skin cells from investigators who reopen the evidence. In a high-profile case, the risk of interpreting such incriminating is amplified by public pressure. This is where statistical modeling becomes crucial. Bayesian frameworks allow investigators to weigh competing probabilities, the likelihood that maternal DNA was deposited during the fatal sequence versus the likelihood it arrived through incidental transfer. For example, suppose the prior probability of accidental transfer on a household object is estimated at 0.2, while the probability of deliberate deposition during direct use is 0.8. If testing reveals a high-level, reproducible profile inside a coordinate, the Bayesian posterior probability heavily favors deliberate contact. Conversely, if a low-level trace appears only on the edge of the blanket and fails to replicate in duplicate runs, the model shifts toward contamination. The point is not to deliver absolute answers but to quantify how much more one scenario is supported over another. Such probabilistic reasoning prevents investigators from falling into the trap of tunnel vision. It forces them to articulate assumptions, test alternative explanations, and calculate how each new result shifts the evidentiary balance. In practice, it is the antidote to overconfidence. Without it, every maternal profile might be read as proof of guilt. With it, analysts can separate signals from noise. Revisiting the Ramsey evidence under 2025 standards would mean extracting every ounce of information from the ransom note, the garrote, and other high-contact items. The potential power is enormous to transform ambiguous fragments into definitive assignments. But the same sensitivity that unlocks clarity also magnifies the risk of contamination, making statistical modeling and replication indispensable. By applying Bayesian logic alongside genealogy-inspired validation, forensic science in 2025 could test the hypothesis rigorously, ensuring that any conclusion, whether pointing to guilt or innocence, rests not on assumption but on quantified probability. When forensic interpretation pivots from outsider to maternal DNA, the legal framework surrounding the case must be recalculated. The first question is whether the passage of nearly 3 decades would prevent prosecution. In the United States, homicide carries no statute of limitations. That means if Patsy were alive in 2025 and modern sequencing tied her conclusively to ligature knots, tape adhesive, and the ransom note, prosecutors could file charges regardless of the elapsed years. Courts have upheld this principle repeatedly. The gravity of murder overrides time bars. DNA would not only provide probable cause but could anchor an indictment that was previously unthinkable. Yet reality complicates this picture. Patsy passed away in 2006. In the hypothetical where her DNA dominates the crime scene, the mother is no longer possible. That shifts attention to the legal concept of accomplice liability. If the evidence pointed to her, investigators would be forced to ask whether any other household member assisted in planning, concealment, or obstruction. Did another person draft parts of the note, help stage the basement, or move objects afterward? In such a scenario, prosecutors might explore charges of conspiracy or accessory after the fact against surviving relatives, if independent corroboration could be developed. The DNA itself would not convict them, but it would redirect investigative energy towards secondary involvement. Another consequence lies in the arena of wrongful exoneration. In 2008, Boulder District Attorney Mary Lacey issued a formal letter clearing the Ramsey family, citing foreign male DNA as proof of an intruder. That decision, controversial at the time, effectively shielded the family from continued public suspicion in the legal sense. Under our altered framework, where maternal DNA saturates the evidence, that exoneration becomes a historic misstep. It would demonstrate how premature reliance on partial genetic profiles can misdirect an entire prosecutorial office. A reversal under the hypothetical would highlight the danger of equating absence of evidence with evidence of absence. Civil ramifications also emerge. If prosecutors could no longer charge the deceased, victims' rights statutes might allow renewed legal motions to formally declare responsibility. Families in similar cases have sought judicial declarations that identify likely perpetrators, even posthumously, to correct the record. Such declarations can reshape the historical understanding of a case, altering the balance between victim protection and reputational harm. In this alternate universe, JonBenet's relatives might face the irony of one branch of the state issuing exoneration in 2008 and another branch reversing course in 25 with the benefit of advanced science. Finally, The broader lesson for the legal system is the volatility of forensic interpretation. If a single shift from unknown male to maternal contributor could so radically alter prosecutorial direction, then safeguards must be built into policy. Statutory requirements for independent replication, cross-laboratory verification, and Bayesian probability assessments could prevent premature conclusions. The legal system must evolve to treat DNA not as infallible scripture, but as one piece of a mosaic, powerful yet vulnerable to context and error. The alternate reading of the Ramsey case, where maternal DNA is assumed to dominate every critical sample, functions as more than a thought experiment. It becomes a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities of modern forensic science. In this framework, three major themes rise: the peril of investigative bias, the power and limits of emerging technology, and the importance of learning from comparable cases where genetic interpretation either messed or nearly collapsed. Bias is not always malicious. Often it grows from subtle anchoring, the desire to reconcile new data with prior beliefs. When analysts or detectives expect outsider involvement, they can unconsciously magnify findings that support that view while minimizing conflicting traces. The opposite is equally dangerous. Once all genetic signals point inward, investigators risk building a tunnel around the family theory and ignoring contamination pathways or innocent explanations. The hypothetical highlights this danger with striking clarity. Between 2023 and 2025, several jurisdictions introduced cold case review panels, independent committees of forensic scientists, statisticians, and legal experts tasked with re-examining stalled investigations. Their purpose was to insulate analysis from departmental bias. In practice, these panels apply blind testing protocols, requiring analysts to examine DNA profiles without being told the identity of reference samples. They also demand probabilistic reporting, ensuring that results are expressed as likelihood ratios rather than absolute declarations. If such a system had existed in the Ramsey investigation, the maternal DNA scenario would have been stress-tested through independent eyes, reducing the risk of premature closure around a single narrative. By 2025, genetic genealogy has become the most transformative investigative technique since fingerprinting. It allows investigators to match partial profiles against vast consumer databases and then map family trees until a suspect emerges. In the Golden State Killer case, a partial profile matched a distant cousin, and genealogists painstakingly reconstructed lineages until they landed on D'Angelo. That success cemented genealogy as a mainstay in cold case work. Applied to the Ramsey hypothetical, genealogy would not serve to hunt an unknown man. Instead, it would validate that the contributor belongs squarely within JonBenet's maternal line. That confirmation would collapse outsider theories, but it also highlights genealogy's redundancy when the contributor is already known. In such circumstances, genealogy serves more as corroboration than revelation. The danger of misinterpreted DNA is not theoretical. History provides examples where overreliance or mishandling of genetic evidence distorted the truth. In the Amanda Knox case, investigators relied on low-level, partial DNA profiles on a knife and a bra clasp to argue her involvement. Years later, independent review revealed contamination risks, poor storage, and interpretive overreach. The appellate court concluded that the DNA did not reliably tie Knox to the scene. The case illustrates how partial, low-quantity profiles can mislead when interpreted without proper statistical caution. Under the Ramsey hypothesis, a similar risk arises: maternal DNA could dominate simply because of environmental ubiquity, not because of deliberate action. Without replication and statistical modeling, the result could become another Knox-like miscarriage. The O.J. Simpson trial offers a different lesson. Here, DNA evidence was abundant and strong, but defense attorneys successfully undermined its credibility by highlighting sloppy collection, cross-contamination, and laboratory errors. Jurors were persuaded that the science, while powerful, was not trustworthy in practice. This demonstrates that even robust genetic matches can be neutralized if chain of custody is compromised. Applied to the Ramsey hypothetical, any maternal DNA match would require impeccable documentation to survive courtroom scrutiny. Without airtight procedures, defense teams could argue that household DNA drifted onto evidence through careless handling, echoing the Simpson defense strategy. The combined weight of these comparisons stresses the need for structured safeguards. Blind testing ensures analysts are not swayed by expectations. Replication at independent labs minimizes the risk of lab-specific contamination. Probabilistic reporting expressing results in likelihood ratios prevents the illusion of certainty. Finally, convergence across disciplines strengthens reliability. DNA should not stand alone but align with fiber analysis, indentation mapping on the ransom note, and environmental markers such as dust and cobwebs. In the Ramsey hypothetical, the lesson is direct. Maternal DNA across every key item would look damning, but without neutral review panels, probabilistic statistics, and multidisciplinary corroboration, there remains the risk of convicting based on ubiquity rather than action. Cold case investigations in the mid-2020s have already shown the importance of these lessons. The same principles must govern all future high-profile cases, ensuring that DNA acts as a witness, not a mirage. The alternate scenario does more than reframe one crime. It teaches the fragility of forensic interpretation and the ease with which bias or overconfidence can twist data into narrative. It shows both the promise and the limits of genetic genealogy, and it reminds us that even the strongest DNA evidence must be contextualized through careful science, independent review, and statistical reasoning. Without those safeguards, investigators risk repeating the errors of Knox or Simpson cases, where genetic evidence was either overstated or discredited. With them, the justice system has a chance to avoid missteps and approach truth with humility. The exercise of reimagining every genetic trace in the Ramsey case as maternal is not meant to convict, but to illuminate the fragile balance between science interpretation and public narrative. A thought experiment of this kind forces us to confront scientific feasibility, ethical responsibility, and the dangers of allowing speculation to bleed into conspiracy. It also sharpens the question of what should be done with the actual evidence that remains in storage, now that technology has advanced to the point where answers once out of reach may finally be within grasp. Begin with the blunt reality: the actual DNA profiles developed in this case contain Y chromosome markers. That means the contributors were male. Substituting Patsy into those positions is, scientifically, an inversion of biological fact. Female DNA cannot be mistaken for male when STR and later sequencing clearly demonstrates sex-specific alleles. In the original laboratory reports, loci on the Y chromosome were documented, confirming the presence of a male contributor outside the immediate family. Any scenario that reassigns those alleles to a female profile directly contradicts the data. This exposes the central scientific flaw of the hypothesis: it is not merely improbable. It is genetically impossible unless the earlier testing was wholly contaminated or misinterpreted. One cannot reconcile female profiles with detection of male-only markers. Under modern whole genome sequencing, such discrepancies would be exposed immediately. The fact that male alleles were observed across multiple samples makes the substitution of Patsy's profile implausible on technical grounds. Yet the point of the thought experiment is not to argue feasibility, but to stress-test investigative interpretation. If DNA could be so thoroughly reassigned, how would the case narrative collapse or reconstruct? It becomes a method for understanding on genetic evidence, and the dangers of treating it as gospel without acknowledging its limits. There is power in using counterfactuals, but also risk. On the one hand, imagining maternal DNA across all evidence forces investigators and the public to see how dependent theories are on a single strand of proof. It demonstrates that science can steer legal systems in opposite directions depending on interpretation. On the other hand, constructing scenarios that directly accuse deceased individuals without possibility of defense carries ethical hazards. It risks fueling conspiracy culture, where speculation hardens into myth and circulates as supposed truth. Forensic science already struggles with public perception. DNA is often treated as infallible, when in reality it is probabilistic, contextual, and vulnerable to error. Hypotheticals like this one, if misused, can deepen mistrust, convincing the public that investigators hide the truth or protect insiders. Such claims have already circulated for decades in this case. By layering in imaginative reconstructions, we must be careful not to supply conspiracy theorists with material that further distorts reality. Ethically, then, the task is balanced. Hypotheticals must be clearly marked as thought experiments designed to test reasoning, not as claims of fact. They must be framed as tools to expose bias and highlight the importance of neutral review. To do otherwise risks weaponizing speculation, turning forensic imagination into a breeding ground for mistrust. The greatest ethical value of this exercise lies in showing how bias works. If every DNA result had truly matched Patsy, investigators would almost certainly have locked onto her as the primary suspect. Tunnel vision would have narrowed, other explanations dismissed, and the case might have rushed toward indictment without considering contamination. Conversely, because the DNA pointed outward, investigators built entire frameworks around strangers, even when other evidence such as the ransom note and the staging suggested internal involvement. This pendulum swing illustrates why forensic analysis must be conducted under blind protocols and reviewed independently. Human beings are prone to confirmation bias, whether they lean toward exoneration or guilt. By flipping the DNA results in this hypothetical, we see how fragile investigative direction can be, how quickly scientific interpretation becomes narrative fuel rather than neutral fact. The Ramsey case has long attracted conspiracy theories, ranging from claims of elite cover-ups to connections with shadowy networks. Injecting a scenario where maternal DNA dominates every item could easily become fodder for these communities. Some would claim it proves law enforcement suppressed results. Others would argue it shows the family was protected. Still others would link it to larger political or social agendas. The danger is a thought experiment designed to test bias could instead inflame suspicion and deepen public mistrust in forensic science. Therefore, communication matters. Any discussion of this scenario must emphasize that it contradicts biological reality, that it is a counterfactual constructed to highlight lessons, not to assert hidden truths. Without that framing, speculation mutates into misinformation. The most constructive outcome of this hypothetical is to push for renewed, transparent testing of the actual evidence with modern tools. By 2025, whole genome sequencing, enhanced probabilistic software, and genealogical triangulation can extract far more information from degraded samples than earlier methods allowed. John Ramsey himself has advocated for such re-examination, arguing that only a definitive resolution through modern science can end decades of suspicion. Recommendations moving forward include full reanalysis of critical items. The ransom note, the garrote, the adhesive tape, the tights band, and the fingernail scrapings should be retested with next-generation sequencing, ensuring full allele recovery and sex-specific confirmation. Independent laboratory replication to prevent bias and accusations of suppression. Testing should be conducted at multiple accredited facilities with blind sample identifiers. Application of Bayesian statistics results should be reported not as absolutes but as likelihood ratios, quantifying the probability of genuine deposition versus contamination. Cold case review panels' independent oversight should guide interpretation, ensuring that neither family protection nor outsider fixation distorts conclusions. Transparent public reporting summaries of testing, methodologies, and probabilistic interpretations should be made publicly available, limiting the oxygen available to conspiracy speculation. Other cases remind us what happens when DNA is either overstated or misinterpreted. In Amanda Knox's trial, partial, low-level DNA traces were treated as decisive, leading to wrongful conviction later overturned when independent review highlighted contamination. In O.J. Simpson's trial, abundant genetic evidence was undermined by sloppy collection and defense arguments about contamination, creating reasonable doubt. Both examples show how forensic evidence must be handled not only with scientific rigor but also with communicative clarity. Otherwise, jurors and the public lose faith. The Ramsey case, under this hypothesis, becomes a parallel cautionary tale. Overconfidence in a single interpretation, whether outsider male DNA or maternal DNA, creates risk of either wrongful conviction or endless suspicion. Only through careful replication, probabilistic reasoning, and transparent reporting can forensic science avoid repeating these mistakes. The imagined scenario where Patsy's DNA permeates every item is scientifically untenable because the real evidence includes Y chromosome alleles. Yet as a counterfactual, it reveals how fragile investigative direction is when anchored too heavily on genetic interpretation. It highlights the ethical responsibility of forensic scientists to guard against bias, to avoid fueling conspiracy, and to communicate clearly when exploring hypotheticals. Most importantly, it underscores the need for renewed, transparent testing of the actual evidence with 2025 technology. Whole genome sequencing, genealogical databases, Bayesian statistics, and independent review panels together can provide clarity that has eluded the case for decades. Only by grounding analysis in reality, not speculation, can the justice system honor the memory of the victim and prevent the cycle of mistrust that grows when science is misused or misunderstood. To close this exploration, it is necessary to step back and view the whole structure of the thought experiment. The guiding assumption was simple but radical. Imagine every DNA trace at the Ramsey scene aligning with Patsy rather than an unidentified male. From that inversion, we reconstructed the crime scene, the ransom note, the cord, the injuries, and the legal consequences. Piece by piece, the narrative shifted away from the intruder framework that dominated public debate and instead pointed inward toward family involvement. Yet when placed against the actual biological record, this alternate path collides with a wall of scientific contradiction. The real profiles include Y chromosome alleles, confirming male contributors. That fact alone makes the maternal hypothesis scientifically impossible. And therein lies the central lesson: forensic interpretation can redirect entire investigations, but it must remain anchored to biological reality. The most striking outcome of the hypothetical is how rapidly the interpretive landscape changes once DNA attribution flips. The garrote ceases to be an outsider's weapon and becomes a household construction. The ransom note stops reading as an external threat and instead looks like staged cover. The blanket draped over the child ceases to signal intruder remorse and becomes evidence of domestic concealment. Every object transforms under the gravitational pull of genetic attribution. That dramatic swing illustrates the disproportionate weight that DNA evidence carries in modern investigations. It can single-handedly elevate one theory while erasing another, even when other physical and behavioral evidence remains constant. At the same time, the maternal DNA assumption collapses under direct confrontation with the real record. The presence of male alleles across multiple samples, the hypothesis is, in literal genetic terms, impossible. Female DNA cannot mimic Y chromosome markers. This tension is the point. The thought experiment reveals how much of the case narrative rests on fragile interpretive scaffolding. When a single variable DNA attrition is altered, the case reconstructs itself completely. But that alteration cannot erase biological fact. This contrast teaches the importance of respecting scientific feasibility, while using hypotheticals only as tools to test reasoning and expose bias. The broader meaning lies in how societies handle genetic evidence. DNA is often treated as final, unquestionable truth. Courts, media, and the public place extraordinary trust in its authority. Yet, as this exploration shows, DNA is not a freestanding oracle. It must be interpreted in context, balanced against contamination risks, environmental ubiquity, and statistical probability. Misinterpretation can fuel wrongful convictions, while premature exonerations can lock families and communities in cycles of suspicion for decades. The ethical responsibility is clear. Forensic scientists must communicate results with transparency, humility, and an awareness of how heavily justice leans on their words. Perhaps the most constructive outcome of this exercise is not the alternate scenario itself, but the push it gives toward renewed, real testing. By 2025, forensic technology has advanced far beyond what was available in 1996 or 2008. Whole genome sequencing can recover complete profiles from degraded samples. Probabilistic genotyping can express results in terms of likelihood ratios rather than absolutes, reducing bias. Genetic genealogy can trace contributors to family networks with unprecedented clarity. Cold case review panels in several states have shown how independent oversight prevents tunnel vision. Applied to the Ramsey evidence, these tools could finally resolve lingering doubts. Re-examining the ransom note, the cord, the adhesive tape, and the fingernail scrapings with modern protocols could confirm or exclude contributors with near absolute certainty. Independent laboratories could replicate findings to ensure reliability. Transparent public reporting could reduce the oxygen available to conspiracy theories. Most importantly, such testing would respect the victim by using the best available science to seek truth rather than speculation. The hypothetical where maternal DNA dominates the crime scene is not scientifically possible given the actual record. But as a counterfactual, it provides an invaluable mirror. It shows how fragile investigations become when they rely too heavily on one category of proof. It highlights the risk of bias, the ethical dangers of speculation, and the overwhelming influence of genetic evidence in shaping public and legal narratives. And it underscores the urgent need to move beyond hypotheticals toward real answers through modern forensic tools. Justice in cold cases does not come from imagined scenarios. It comes from confronting evidence with rigor, testing it with the best available science, and communicating results with humility. The Ramsey case, still unsolved nearly 3 decades later, deserves nothing less. The path forward is not in rewriting the past with impossible assumptions, but in applying today's technology to the actual samples, ensuring that truth, not bias, not speculation, finally has the last word.